Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome, everybody. We are already having a party behind the scenes here today with Heather and Dani. And this is super exciting because it's the 100th episode. And we've got Heather on here that has listened to every single one of my episodes. And Dani here has produced all of them behind the scenes. So they're going to share a little bit more about themselves. And I will kick it off and have Dani go first.
Awesome. Well, yes, I am Danielle Hamlet, but you can call me Dani because everyone does. And I am a social media podcast manager. So this is kind of where I come into the scene with Karen. It's kind of like she's picked me up from the backstage and put me on stage. So hello. And the unique thing about me, I live in Michigan with like 3 kids, 2 animals, dog and a cat, and a very tall husband. So right now it's a blizzard, so it's a interesting time.
Oh my gosh, Dani. And your cat loves snow. I saw that great video this morning.
Yes, he's a little guy, and it's been hard to keep him in the house. Like he just goes bounding off into the snow mounts, and I had to have someone chase him down. So yeah.
I love it. Well, I am so glad that you stepped out of perhaps your comfort zone, but I don't know. I also think that you're also very, very accomplished at speaking as well as being behind the scenes. Obviously, you do that for a living too. So I'm just thrilled that you are here today to join us on stage. So let's turn it over to Heather. 100 episodes. Oh my God. Or no, all the episodes that you've listened to, but tell us about yourself first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Fison. I'm a brand and website designer based in Portland, Oregon. And I have a really fun story with how I met Karen, and we'll get to that shortly. I'm so glad to be connected with her, and I have listened to every single episode, and I am an avid podcast listener in general. I listen to hours of podcasts a week. So I am the reason for Apple Podcast existence, I think. So I'm excited to dive in today.
I love it. That's so amazing. And first of all, there's so much that we have as far as history with how we met, and then all of the help that you also gave me as feedback, because for anybody that's listening to this, full disclosure, I don't listen to that many podcasts. I barely do. And so I didn't know what I was doing, let alone I didn't know, well, first of all, I didn't know what I was doing launching a podcast in the first place. And then I didn't even know what to look for. So you were so helpful for that. But I want to talk first about what would you say is the impact from the podcast on you overall, and anything that you want to share related to that.
I love your solo episodes. They're some of my favorite because to me, this podcast is full of really practical, implementable tips and tricks. It's fun to listen to other podcasts that maybe have more storytelling, or I love true crime. There's a time and place for those type of podcasts, but as someone who has her own business and a job in corporate, there's so many opportunities for me to actually implement the things that you talk about on the podcast. So I'd love to share a couple of my top episodes that I would recommend your listeners go back and check out.
Yes.
So one of them is it's actually episode 33. It's called Words to Avoid and What to Say Instead. This has probably been the most impactful out of all of them, because after trying some of the tweaks, and I'll mention a couple in a second, it not only makes you come across more confident, but I found that it's actually made me feel more confident and empowered. Wow. The biggest one I would say is changing I think to I believe, or what do you think about this, or something a little bit more grounded, I would say. Using I think is something that slips out all of the time, and it's difficult to come across a little bit more sure of what you're trying to say and what suggestions you're trying to make. And I've used that one specifically. I changed jobs last fall and used that in my interviews. I catch myself constantly where if I hear myself say it, the next thing in the meeting and next time I share something, I will use I believe, or let's not find some other way to say it. So I would say that episode is just chock full of ideas for things that you should avoid saying, but also what you should turn and say instead. Definitely recommend checking that out.
Well, and I want to interject there for a minute, Heather, because for those that haven't listened to it yet, I want to clarify the difference with when we say, because there's a couple things there to keep in mind, that instead of saying, for example, I think this is a good idea, saying this is a good idea. And so what's funny is that it's the language, but then it's also how we say it, as you well know. When we say, I think, versus if you said, I think this is a great idea, even that sounds better. But eliminating I think, I also find it fascinating that it doesn't take away the meaning of the content. All it does is add a modifier that you don't need. So I wanted to add that on there for anybody that wants an immediate tip at the moment.
Exactly. There is a psychological component. That's what I find so fascinating is, yes, it makes an impact on how you come across to other people. But that's the piece that's been so fascinating to me, is just changing it for myself makes me feel like I'm actually bought into the idea more, right? Sometimes you share your thoughts, but you actually aren't certain if what you're sharing is actually a good idea or worth mentioning. And it's so hard to speak up sometimes in general. So anyway, that is definitely a top one for me that I've gone back to. I actually have that one saved. So
I love
definitely recommend it. Another one is another solo episode that you did. It's episode 77, and it's how not to lead a sales call. And because of my having a brand and website design business, it's helpful to hear from the perspective of the potential client or customer as to how some of these really common ways of operating in a sales call or kind of easy slip ups you can make, how much that affects your experience as the customer or client. So that one is one that's the piece that I would say stuck out the most of that is that question of, does that make sense? Oh my gosh, I say that so much, and I'm working on changing that as well. I love your turnaround there too. What resonates with you, or how does that land? These are things that you've talked about in many episodes, but I would say in terms of speaking about it in a sales call format, that was really
good. I'm so glad. And in fact, Dani has a podcast called Discovery Call Podcast. And I'm curious to know, Dani, what do you think? What did you think about that episode?
I thought it was fantastic. And I just want to clarify one thing. Karen said at the front that I have produced all of the episodes. I produced half of them because I came in more in episode 50. So just in case there's previous podcast producers feel offended. But no, I'm episode 50 and onward.
That is true. That is true. Right after I said it, I thought, well, that's not true. Thank you for calling me out.
That's all right. I just don't want to claim it all.
Keeping it honest.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I really took away from that conversation is that you don't want to come into a sales call or a discovery call, and it's not about you peacocking and just showing just like, this is how great I am. Like there's an element of credibility you want to establish, but this is about them having the space to share why they're even on this call. And it should always be making sure that you're listening before you're delivering it, because I think we tend to assume a lot of why that person's here on this call, and there's just so much nuances to that. So I think, and that's something that's going to be harder, I think, to prepare for, because you have to really develop some really good listening skills.
Yeah, that is so true. And one thing too that I'll highlight, that whole episode was birthed out of one of the worst discovery call experiences that I had as a potential client. And I was shocked at how one thing after another came, but came at me. But I would say that just like you said, Dani, it all culminates back to being a good listener and letting the potential client do the talking. And if all she had done at the beginning is say, what would most serve you during this call? That would have given me the ability to start talking, because what ended up happening is she ended up talking most of the time, and then it didn't even address what I actually needed. So I feel like I could go out and do a whole podcast right now on that. So I'm going to stop and turn it back to you, Heather, and say, what else? What else do you want to share?
Yeah, Dani, that's really impactful what you mentioned, and I'll take that away and kind of let that simmer some more. It's super true in terms of how easy it is for us to have a script and come in and almost make some assumptions about what someone needs, as opposed to actually asking, because sometimes people don't know, and that's okay. Then you can probe some more, but at least you're not starting from this place of making a lot of assumptions and then ultimately not getting the sale, right? It doesn't benefit you in the long run if you aren't willing to do that. Actually, the last episode I wanted to share really ties in well, because it is an interview episode, and it was episode 51, Inside Out Confidence, with Sue Revel, I think is where you pronounce her name.
Yeah, that is.
Wow, really phenomenal. She's an amazing person. And what struck me about that episode was the fact that, Karen, the questions that you had sent her ahead of time, it felt as if she had sort of re-reflected on all of her past experiences. And that's what I also really enjoyed about the interviews that you've done, is you find a way to ask questions that are really meaningful and that bring out those stories that are relatable from people. And hers by far was just one of my favorites, because it felt so raw and as if she were really processing things in the moment with you. And that just goes to show again that how important listening is. And you may have some sort of general questions and plan at the beginning, but if you're listening, then you can take what someone says and dig in deeper to that and sort of choose where you go, instead of sort of yanking someone out of that experience and then just moving them on to another question. And yeah, there's so many of those. It does make me think about how you and I met, which we promised the listeners we'd share. So let's dig into that. So actually, the person we met through was on episode 10 of the podcast, Jen Whitmer. She held some kind of I think it was the end of the year webinar in 2020 about planning your next year. And Karen and I were just both happened to be there. We'd never interacted in any way before, but I was really struck with the way Karen came across. I mean, you all listeners have heard her on her podcast and social media and everything. So just the vibe that she gave off made me think, I really want to know more about this person. And so I found her on Instagram and just sent a message and reached out to see if she'd want to connect. And I am so appreciative that you were open to that, because you and I didn't get a chance to talk directly on that call or in that online meeting whatsoever. And I just felt like a kindred spirit type of feeling when you and I got to chat on Zoom the first time.
Yes, me too. Well, I had such a girl crush on you during that meeting as well. And then when you reached out, I went, what? Because I was going to reach out to you. So it's one of those things. And it's such a good example of how in a sea of people, you often have one or two people that really stand out to you, whether it's at a networking event or a retreat or, wherever it might be. And I think that's also a good reminder to follow your gut. Like for anybody listening, when you feel that urge of, oh, I want to reach out, and you go, oh no, maybe I wouldn't. And I mean, because I feel just as privileged as you, Heather. So even for you to say, I'm so glad that you reached out. And I think that a lot of us feel that hesitancy to say, well, maybe I won't. Or, I mean, you took the step and did reach out. And a lot of people don't do that. So I also want to remind everybody that's listening to follow that nudge that you have and go for it. So I love that you followed yours, and here we are today. And I got also so much great coaching on how to do my podcast intro and outro and all of that good stuff. And by the way, everybody, Heather also gave me some great coaching not that long ago to mention at the end about my services. And I don't remember exactly how you posed that, Heather. If you want to share it, please do. But I'm trying to remember. I just went, oh my gosh, you're right. I never do that.
I think you got it coming at you from multiple sides, because I think I had mentioned something about it, and then I believe a coach or some other person you were working with perhaps had brought it up with you as well. It's one of those situations where the podcast, you have essentially a captive audience. I mean, people are, when I listen to podcasts, I'm typically doing other things, but still often I have earbuds in. I mean, I'm not listening to anything else except for, whatever the episode is. And so I think we, in general, I don't want to say all women are like this, but I would say often we feel that we're going to come across too salesy if we share about what we do. And that's something I've worked through and continue to work through with talking about my own business, and feeling like, oh, well, I'm not at this point, so I don't want to share about it because I haven't made it to this certain level I think I should be at. And it felt like a natural way for you to just share, hey, by the way, I do this other thing. I actually enjoy speaking on stages. And I think a takeaway from that would just be to know that just because that, I would say that when you have something to offer the world, see it as a service to other people and not so much as just a self-promotion. If people don't know that you can help them, then that's less people potentially that you're able to help.
Yeah, it's so true. It's that visibility factor. I always tell people, you don't want to be the best kept secret in your industry. You have to be able to share that, yes, I exist. I'm here. And I love that you came from a place of service. That's so you, and so exactly what I represent as well. At least that is my goal always. Anything else you want to share, Heather, before we have Dani chime in here? Because Dani is also, I can see you like, I want to hear so much what you're saying too. So, or thinking, but Heather, anything else?
No, I'm ready to hear from Dani myself, because now from this listener perspective, I want to hear more about the behind the scenes aspects. So let's kick it over to you.
Yes, Dani, tell us, what do you want to tell us?
Yes, no, just to say, I joke with my husband that I collect clients of people I want to learn from, which has actually been incredibly true. And so it has always been a joy. So if you ever in a podcast producer environment, the number one advice is, choose clients and work with clients that you enjoy listening to their podcasts as you produce it. So without saying, that has definitely been my story, working with Karen's podcast and the back end. So questions about, I think when I first came on, it was very like last minute production style, right? It was kind of like, there's a deadline. We met every single one, y'all. Like we did, but it was just like, get this one out by this time. Okay, this is the deadline. It was always just very tight. And now it is, we got wiggle room, and it's been beautiful. Like it's so good.
And that's because of you, by the way.
The anxiety levels are just a little less down. And so it's a very technical side, but that has been kind of that journey at that end. But yeah, I think one of the questions you kind of had me thinking about is like, what is the takeaways? Like, what is my experience having listened to every episode? I get to it before anyone else does. And I really soak it in and make those show notes. And one of the biggest shifts I've seen is that when I first came on, you did a lot of guest episodes and some solo episodes here and there. And we listened to the people who have been listening and said, you know what? People really like to hear from you, Karen. Like they want to hear like your advice and your tips. And so we do it more 50-50 now. But my biggest takeaway, really listening to all of these guests you have on your podcast, you interview powerhouses of women who have like years of experience and they have overcome so much in their life. And the thing that you'll hear time and time again is that getting to that level of confidence, going up to that next level, has always required a season of introspection, a season of really opening themselves up to be like, okay, what is really going on here? And just leaning into the hardness of it. I think there's a reason why we don't do it naturally. And the reason why, Karen Laus, what you say here in the podcast is so impactful, because most of the time we go through life not really thinking about how we come off. When you really think about it, like we visually, okay, we doll ourselves up, visually our clothes, we think about that. But like, if you're hearing phrases of, if you have to say, I didn't mean it that way, or oh, that's not what I meant, or that was not my intentions at all. And you kind of begin to realize I come off a certain way and there's a gap between what I'm thinking and how I'm presenting myself. Mm-hmm. And I think we often believe that can't be helped. Oh, it's just the way I am. But Karen, you come in and you say, no, this is like a muscle that you can build. You can cultivate it so that who you are here is presented out there. It's not, there's not a discrepancy. And that journey is a process. It's not like a one coaching session and you're done, right, Karen?
Right.
I think you recommend 6 months. Yeah. Oh man, you're gonna be out of business so fast. But it's a process. And in the guest episodes, you can hear that journey. Like how long did that take? Oh, 20 years, 10 years.
I know.
And you're like, oh, okay. Like give yourself a lot more grace.
It's so true, isn't it? I'm laughing because I'm thinking about a friend of mine many years ago when we were considering, or we were both in this leadership group, and we learned of somebody that had been in it for 10 years. And we thought, 10 years, what? We recently laughed because we have both been in the same group for 10 years now. And it's true. We all want the quick fix. And I always joke with people. Yeah. People go, well, how do I work on my filler? How can I start pausing more and not do so many filler words? I say, if I had a pill to give you to eliminate those filler words, I would sell it, believe me. But
yeah, you'd be long retired, living in New York or traveling the world more than you already do.
I know. But it's such a good reminder that personal growth does take a lot of intention and time and support. I feel like that really became true for me when I actually was able to renegotiate a contract. And I remember thinking, as it was a client during COVID that had said yes, and then they said no, of course. And then 2 years later, they came back and I thought, I only suggested this for 3 months before it. And I'd say a minimum of 6 months is really what I work with my clients on. Typically, I mean, I will do 3 months and I'll even do one session. Sometimes there are things you can get done. But if we're looking for that sustainable change, just like you're talking about, Dani, it definitely takes time. And I love that you said have grace, because we've got to have grace for ourselves, because it's also really important to remember, like I work with so many high achieving women that want it to be nailed, right? When they like, yes, I'm going to nail this, I'm going to do this. And yet we have to remember that we have spent a lifetime, regardless of how old you are, you've spent that lifetime with establishing the habits that you have now. And then when you discover, oh, I mean, this obviously is for anything, that whether you're working on your communication or your health or whatever, but we have to recognize that these things definitely are going to take longer than we think, most of the time, for sure. So
yes,
Dani,
it's meant to encourage you.
What was that?
It's meant to encourage you right now, not to be like, oh no, but just
Good
like,
point.
just
Thank you.
lean in.
bring it back. Like, this is so hard. Don't anybody start. So what else, Dani? I know, do you want me to throw out some of these questions, or do you want to just jump in with some of your thoughts?
Yeah. How about you throw me one and I'll see what happens.
So, well, one of the things that I thought, well, this is a little bit more related to my book, but I do want to bring this to the podcast. I mean, I think it's all connected. But one of the things that was really touching to me personally was after you read it, you said, wow, I really feel like I can roll up my sleeves and do this. And I think, Heather, you said something similar at the beginning of this episode, just simply about what keeps you listening is the practical tips. And I'm curious to know, like Dani and Heather for that matter, but let's start with you, Dani. How have you implemented some of these things into your own life or your own business?
Yes. Yeah. So to kind of go back to like the starting point of this, I read the book before everybody else did. You see a point here, right? I get to consume content before you.
Yes, you do.
Anyway, but one of my biggest takeaways after going through the book is, my goodness, there's a lot here. And you did a good job saying this is a journey. Basically, read through it and pick one you want to focus on. Pick a chapter, pick a practice, and religiously do it for a while and see what comes from it. And I think that, it kind of goes back to what I said, that we often don't think about how we are perceived and our presence and what an impact of investing in that could be. And then your book really lays that foundation, but then also says, here's what to do, here's what to practice, here's some tools that you can use. And you walk away being like, my goodness, give me a couple of years with this book and with Karen Laus, something crazy could happen. So like, there's just like it's hopeful. Crazy good that can happen. And so that was the feeling I had coming away from this. And I just think that this podcast is a great tool to have in your life, because you're going to be constantly be reminded of the tips and the tricks. And then sometimes they show up at a time you really need to hear it. I mean, you dropped an episode on how to prepare for an interview. And I can imagine there's people who are like, my goodness, I need to prepare for an interview. This is perfect timing. Or to circle back when you have a friend who's really nervous about one. So there's just so many, it's just so many reminders in how you can continue to invest in yourself and grow. So
I love it. That's fantastic. Thank you, Dani. How about you, Heather?
Wow, Dani, you just steal all of the thunder. Oh my gosh, how could I say that any better than what you just summed up? You spoke it and said it so beautifully. Oh my. I won't belabor this because I know I went over it quite a bit at the beginning with speaking about one of my favorite episodes, but I have been really impacted by the avoid this, try this instead. Often it's, I would say online, there you can find all kinds of lists on sort of what not to do, but there's not always really practical solutions as to what to do instead, kind of what not to do. And another piece of that besides the spoken part is body language. And that's something that I don't have a specific episode, but I know that you speak a lot about in all contexts on your Instagram, as well as on the podcast, etc. And that's another one of those really really small changes, even just rolling your shoulders back, standing up. I've heard, of course, doing like power poses before you get into a meeting, whatever you have to do to sort of hype yourself up. But yeah. Even as we were chatting about before the podcast episode started today, this idea that you can reframe it for yourself. You can either get really stuck on this idea that you're really scared, that you're not going to do well. Just, we all have sort of the self-doubt spiral that we can get into really easily. Right. But it's almost just as easy to change the words and just say, I'm excited. And just, even if you have to feel like you are lying to yourself when you say it, I think there's still something about that internally starts to make that shift, even a few degrees, where you feel like you can sort of shake it off a little bit, and that it's like, your body, they say physically, your response is the same regardless of whether you're nervous or excited. So if you just frame it to yourself that you're excited, you can move forward. But I would say some of the body language pieces have been really helpful for me. And the last bit I'll share, which is more related actually to your Instagram, but I think it's just how you show up as part of your branding, for lack of a better way to say it, is that I love how you are always looking around in the world and picking up those tips and tricks to share. Yes, you have your polished, like here you have a beautiful top and necklace on and your background set up, but there's a lot of times you go to yoga class and you get out and you're sweaty and you have something to share because it just occurred to you, right? And that's the thing that makes you so dang relatable. And that's the piece where it makes you feel like, oh, okay, we're on the same level. You're not, yes, you have years of experience and you're coaching people, but just to say that if Karen can do it, like I can too, as opposed to you sort of being up and far away and sort of feeling like those of us who are listening can never get there.
I love it. Well,
I'm taking notes, Heather, because I help manage the social media too. And I'm like, all right, I'm gonna write that down.
Somebody mentioned yesterday, it was such a wonderful compliment, but I hadn't thought of myself this way before, but they called me bold and unapologetic. And I thought, again, unapologetically myself. And I thought, yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, I don't really care anymore what people see of me. Like if I have a thought and I'm inspired after yoga, like you said, or being in the gym, I'm going to talk about it for sure. So that means a lot to me. Well, Dani, I know at one point we had talked about, I would love to have your advice to anybody that's listening about starting a podcast and what advice you would offer them, and would love to hear a little bit more about the thought process behind that. Because, and before you do, I will say, because what I didn't say at the beginning here, I joked about this a couple of times, but I truly did not intend to have a podcast. And this is such a good example of sometimes we have to seize opportunities when they strike. And I was similar to how you and I met, Heather, I was at a different networking event, met Ebony Wiley, and she is the one that we both felt this connection. She connected with me. And then suddenly she said, well, do you have a podcast? I thought, well, I never thought of that. Or I shouldn't say I'd never thought about it. I was thinking further down the line. And then that's when she said, well, I could help you. And so I definitely want to give her credit as the inspiration behind starting it. And she had a executive full-time job at the time, but she had been launching her own podcast and then helped launch a couple of others. And that's when she said, well, I could help you. And then within 3 weeks, I had a podcast also with your help, Heather, in the coaching about what is best to include in an intro. You also really helped me narrow that down so that it wasn't too long. So those are some of the things that I wanted to say here at the outset. And then just the fact that, wow, looking back now, a lot of times we think, well, I don't want to start something that's going to take too much work, or how am I going to sustain that? And then it's like anything in life, you take one step and then you take the next and the next, and then suddenly now here we are, 100 episodes later, and with a fan that has listened to all of them. Thank you, Heather, and Dani, who has produced most of them. So let's hear what advice you have for people, Dani.
Yeah, no, I love this. And how you started with, kind of the advice and someone coming in, and that is a great way to kind of use that momentum of, I'm going to start a podcast, and then just kind of launching it is really helpful. That kind of gets you there. And the other thing that I like to remind people, though, and just to kind of counter that, is that when you start a podcast, you are submitting a currency of sorts. Your currency is either time So you're investing in time and editing and show notes and all of that stuff, or you're outsourcing. So your currency is legit money, right? You're having people come along and support you in the longevity of that podcast. So that's just something to keep in mind as you set up your podcast. I wouldn't say don't have that hold you back, because if you say, I don't have like a ton of time, I do have some time to do a podcast, maybe don't do it weekly, do it every other week. The beautiful thing is you can set your own schedule. The goal is to stay on it, that what you set, right? So I think that's just something to keep in mind. Is would be that. Another thing, there's so many different intentions behind the podcast. Okay. So just to kind of break it down, there is like the hobby podcast where maybe someone's doing this because it's like a passion project. And from there, it's like, whatever you're interested in, you kind of invest in and put that into a podcast. Then you have the podcasts are set up to be part of a funnel of your business. Some people really want the podcast to be kind of like that top funnel where people get funneled into their world. And then, Karen, your podcast is interesting in that I don't think it has really necessarily been designed to be that top of the funnel. Like we can say, wow, all of Karen's leads are coming from this podcast. Yours is definitely connected to your business, but you have a serving heart behind it. It's kind of like, this is where I create a platform for other women to share their confidence journeys to help each other grow together. And by the way, this is what I do. And that's perfectly fine. Like, that's okay. But you kind of have to go into your podcast thinking, okay, what category in which am I designing this podcast to serve? And what is the people, who are the people I'm speaking to? And how am I going to keep this consistent? I tell people, don't look at the downloads for at least the first 6 months if you can. I'm telling you, it goes like this. And podcast is a long game. So like Karen, you've played it. You're at the 100th episode right now, but like it takes a while to kind of get that audience base growing and that traction. So definitely a podcast is fantastic, and it is not necessarily oversaturated. I would say right now at this point, if you look up podcast, the name of the game is to find one that's still active. Yes, there's a lot out there, but I would say people who are consistently putting out episodes, they are more in the 10% of podcasts out there. And so it is worthwhile pursuing. It's just make sure you have that support and that plan to keep consistent. And there's other things I can say too, but I want to give Heather a chance to kind of like, when someone's starting a podcast, Heather, what are your like number one tips really as a listener?
Say, thinking about it from the listener perspective as to what do you want them to leave the podcast either with as actual something tip or trick, with a feeling. Start with the end in mind, as they say. I do think it's worth doing that, because often people will say, I want to start a podcast just because other people are doing it. And what is your core reason behind that? Do you want it to be super practical with a lot of takeaways like Karen's podcast? Do you want just people to feel encouraged? Do you want people to feel heard and understood based on the people that you are interviewing? It could be multiple of those things, but I would say starting there is really important. In terms of some of the more practical, what do I talk about? What do I share? The length of everything. I'm someone who it's a personal preference, but I don't like listening to super long intros, or for that matter, necessarily super long outros. I want to get to the meat of it. I think I'm probably more so tuned to also how YouTube is as well, for the most part, where it's like, get into the content. Nobody needs to know a ton of stuff about you. That's why you have your website and your social media and all the other places. I'm putting you in my ears while I'm doing the dishes or going for a walk. Like, give me something to sort of like latch onto. So that's where I come from with that. But if someone's thinking about their content on the podcast and what they would put out there, this applies maybe more for those people in business, but if you're putting out content in some other way already, like a blog, social media, Pinterest, just LinkedIn, I would go and look at some of the posts that have had the most traction for you, the most views, the most likes, the most shares, and use that as a starting off point as to what subject matter or content do people seem to or what content resonates most with people. And that could give you an idea of maybe, is that something you can elaborate on in a podcast? You have people you could interview for that, and go from there as well. So those would be some of the tips that I have. But I do think consistency is key. But, you know, to give someone else or give anyone listening something that's maybe not so intimidating to start, is that maybe just tell yourself you're going to make 12 episodes and you're going to release one a week. And that's basically, you know, one quarter, and just see how that goes. You may get into it and then you may say, okay, like I'm done. and that's okay too.
Yeah.
But if you're wanting to try it, give yourself something that feels attainable. And then as you keep going, you may love it. And that's where Karen's at, I think, where it's 100 episodes. I just want to stop and celebrate that. Congratulations to both of you and Dani. This is a lot of work to put in, but there are listeners more than just me who have been very impacted by your work. So I want to end with a celebration and gratitude for you.
Aw, thank you, Heather. Yeah, it's crazy to me what Dani said earlier, just statistically. I didn't know that until fairly recently, that 10% of the podcasts are what they stop at 10 episodes or fewer, something like that, right? And it's such a good example of, and I love the what you said too, Heather, about just do what you can, basically try it, see what you think. I mean, let's face it, life is an experiment. You give it a go and see what you come up with, and if you like it.
Yeah, make it into a season. Like, say this is season 1, and that kind of gives you a stopping point. So that if say you've halfway through, you're like, I can't sustain this, hey, complete season 1 and you fulfilled your commitment. So that's really helpful. And I think I want to piggyback a little bit what Heather said, keeping the end of mind. Just remember, I know I told you don't worry about your downloads, and it's true. It's just don't. It's numbers that go up and down, but think of like, what is that next step after listening to your podcast episode? What is the next step you want them to take? And so having like an actual lead magnet, for example, that is right there in their show notes, get them in the email list, get them into your world is huge. Maybe something you just offer, like, because you listen to my episode and you are a podcast listener, you get this free whatever. And get creative with these lead magnets. You know, it can be PDFs. It could be like a Trello board template. It could be some people have like private podcast episodes, so you can join the private podcast. What would be like that next step where you can actually measure people responding, people are joining my world from this? That's going to be the metric you really want to follow. So that's just kind of like a little random last minute tip for any people who are in business thinking about starting a podcast, that the goal is, yes, people listen, but get them on their email list, and I will just release you from there. So
she's releasing us. She has the power to release us. So thank you both for being on the episode. Is there anything that I haven't asked or that you wanted to share that you'd like to wrap up with?
I think just to do a full circle, one of the things, having worked with Karen, and one of her values is celebration. And one of the things that we have done is every week we are asked to celebrate something from that week. And it has been absolutely amazing on how little I celebrate on a regular basis. And so I think, yes, we're celebrating 100 episodes, but you as a listener have something to celebrate as well. And this is just a really good practice. I mean, the fact that sometimes Karen has asked that question and it's on Voxer and it took me an hour to think about something to celebrate, like, you know, I guess I'm breathing. That's good.
whatever you can come up with, right?
Exactly. But just like, yeah, it's such a posture change to life. And I think has such a ripple effect. And so thank you for having me on just to celebrate 100 episodes and celebrate your mission. And it's just been awesome.
Well, I'm so glad. And it's such a good reminder for anybody listening. Take that time to celebrate and be intentional about it. Even if it is, people talk so much about having a gratitude journal, saying what you're grateful for when you wake up and when you go to bed. And this is in the same vein, really, because it continues to foster that positivity and it helps reinforce what we want to keep doing. So it's fantastic. And it's so fun to share in other people's wins as well. So in the spirit of that, before you go, Heather, Dani, what is one thing that we can celebrate with you? And then I'll ask you the same thing, Heather.
Oh my goodness. I should have known by bringing that up. I'll tell you in an hour. Just kidding.
Yeah, she queued you up for it. Dan.
I know. And I was like, oh no, what did I do to myself? I think my biggest celebration is this past year, my business has grown. So I'm a freelancer. I own my own business, have multiple clients. And so that has been really cool to see. But that next step is getting that team member on with me. And so that is a huge celebration. I'm really looking forward to just increasing the bandwidth in a way. So
awesome. Congratulations. That's fantastic. Such congratulations. And where can people reach you, Dani?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram as Dani Hamlet. My website should be in the show notes as well. That's Danielle Hamlet. I know, Dani and Danielle. It's the same person. And I'm also on LinkedIn as Dani Hamlet as well.
I love it. Fabulous. And how about you, Heather? What are we celebrating?
I want to celebrate the times when I show up when I don't feel like it.
Beautiful.
There are times when you don't feel confident, you don't feel ready. And the times that I have pushed through that and shown up, today is one example of that. We all have those times where you just don't feel yourself, you're not connected to yourself, you don't feel very grounded. But I find through taking the action, it gets you closer to that. So I'm just gonna celebrate that for myself for today.
Yay. Well, that I have to say that is a great tee up for something that I hadn't thought of sharing, but too bad I didn't share this earlier. But I remember when I met Ebony, which started the whole thing here with this podcast, I had stayed up really late, probably till 2 a.m. And I found myself laying in bed at 10 to 9, so wanting to keep sleeping. And this networking call was at 9 a.m. And I said out loud, put on your big girl panties and get out of bed because you said you were going to be there and you need to show up. And that is where I met Ebony. And that's how all of this started. So that's a good full circle, Heather, to bring us to the end here. And where can we reach you?
Yes, thanks for asking. I have a website, which is just my first and last name. So heatherfison.com, Fison. And I'm at Heather Fison on Instagram.
Awesome. Well, I am so happy that you two joined me today. And for everybody listening, think about one thing that you want to celebrate, whether it's a big milestone win that you had, or simply, like Heather said, showing up. Sometimes it's simply waking up and getting out of bed. And those celebrations are important to keep as a regular practice. So thank you all for listening to all of these episodes. And if you're just joining us for the 100th episode, I look forward to you hearing more. And as Heather and Dani also would remind me to say, if you are interested in working with any of us, Heather is an incredible web designer and graphic designer and just extraordinary of travel and food. And Dani is just fabulous at so many things in the social media arena, in writing emails for people. How many of us hate writing our own emails? So she writes emails for people. She does podcast production, and she is a person full of positivity and grace. And I'm so excited for either of you or anybody listening to reach out to them if you'd like to learn more. And of course, if you'd like to have me speak at one of your events, I would love to do that. So you know where to find me. All right. That's a wrap. Have a great day, everybody.
Congratulations on your 100th podcast episode. Thank you for helping me find my voice and showing me that my opinions do matter. Because of you, I've been able to put tactics into action and have made all the difference in my life in a very short amount of time. Thank you and congratulations again.
Congratulations on 100 episodes, Karen. I love your podcast. You offer so much value. And the 2 episodes that stand out to me are the Discovery Call episode. You have helped me transform my discovery calls so that it is something that I walk into and I'm very calm and I know exactly what to say. And the other episode I really loved was talking about interviews, how to go into an interview confidently. And so I really appreciate what you have done with the podcast. I am so appreciative of you for sharing your knowledge with us. And I'm cheering you on. And I love you, friend.
Every time I hear Karen on her podcast, I learn something new. She is so real and down to earth while also providing exceptional insights and practical communication strategies that I can apply in my professional and personal life. She provides real-life examples of what not to do, along with how to make changes to more effectively communicate with confidence. This podcast is well worth the listen, and I highly recommend it.
I love the Ignite Your Confidence podcast because Karen offers actionable items that I can bring into my business the very day I listen to it. Happy 100 episodes, Karen.
And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.